Well, this really enables me to indulge my train driver fantasies. But is there a dream that really could come true, turning rail freight electric? Welcome to the show, where we're all about how we can move heavy goods around in a more environmentally friendly way. How about electric goods trains? Also on today.
We might be back from the COP28 climate summit in Dubai, but the conference continues. Are they inching towards an agreement on fossil fuels? We'll bring you the latest. We'll also take you to Sheffield, where, in a UK first, these giant fans are sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to make jet fuel.
Welcome to Trafford Park rail freight terminal just outside Manchester. Now, moving stuff by train rather than road is already the greener alternative. But going electric and unhooking from diesel, that's proving a long way down the track. This is Manchester Freightliner terminal, handling up to 20 trains a day, taking containers to and from the UK's deep sea ports. So how many of these are you shifting through here?
So we'll move 100,000 containers through Manchester every year. Wow. And we'll do about 500,000 countrywide.
Moving things by rail takes 6 million lorries off our roads every year and emits considerably less carbon. And what sort of things are on board?
Anything and everything you can imagine, you know, everything from wine to exports from here, like cereal products, expensive cars.
You say wine, is that a whole load of bottles?
Not at all, no. So some of these will be filled with what we call a bladder that will contain, I think, 22,000 litres of wine. The wine is extracted from the bladder and put into the glass bottles that you then see in the supermarket.
I can imagine there's a bit of a Christmas rush for moving wine around. But getting more freight onto rails has its challenges.
Sometimes road is cheaper. You know, the cost of running a train increases every year by retail price index. The track access charges we pay, whereas of course road doesn't see that huge increase in price. Price of electricity, for example, has really spiked recently, and that makes it much more expensive to run these environmentally friendly trains.
I think this is our train. Where are we going?
So this train is going to Felixstowe. So it's fully loaded. There's about 56 containers on it. It's going to Felixstowe via Crewe.
And where are we going to go? Are we riding the freight car?
Yeah, so we're going to go in the cab with the driver. Coming up.
It's quite a height. Oh, here we are.
Okay, and welcome to the cab. Let me introduce you to Duncan.
Hi Duncan, nice to see you. Oh, I'm looking forward to this. We're riding in one of Freightliner's electric trains, powered by overhead wires, but the bulk of the fleet still runs on diesel. We're on an electric line now, driving under electric power. Why can't you do this everywhere?
Yeah, well, wherever we can, we do, but unfortunately a lot of the lines we travel over are not electrified at all.
Earlier this year, the company temporarily stopped running electric, even on sections that do have overhead wires. Why did you dump electricity a while back and go back to diesel?
Yeah, so for a short period of time we had to put the diesel trains back on rather than electric because of the price of electricity. It was costing over £1,000 extra per train that was running just to pay for that extra electricity, and that was far more than the business would be viable under that condition.
And now, is it still more expensive to run electric?
It is more expensive to run electric, but there are other benefits that we get from electric traction. It's more reliable to start with, so you know, we've taken a calculated risk that we will pay that extra amount. What I'd really like to see is what happens with some of my colleagues in Germany, where they're capping the price of electric traction for trains, so that it's never more than the price of diesel.
And the drivers prefer it too.
The electric trains are brilliant. They're nice, comfortable, quiet. They got the speed, so you know it's not like the diesels would take some time.
So they're actually faster accelerating than diesels are?
Yes.
How much train have you got behind you here?
So we've got 617 metres, weight-wise 1,500 tonne.
And how would that distance, I mean that's well over half a kilometre, not far off half a mile, how would that compare to say a passenger train?
It's probably 3 times the length of the longest passenger train.
Only 9% of freight currently moves this way in Britain, and our ageing infrastructure hinders growth, with freight and passenger trains jostling for space.
What about HS2? What is the impact of the cancellation north of Birmingham Stafford had?
Yeah, HS2 is really fundamental to allow us to run more freight trains because the passenger network is really congested. So by the trains moving away from the traditional network onto HS2, more parcel freight, faster parcel freight. So we spend less time sitting in loops waiting for passenger trains to go by. We can use our equipment more productively. In some respects, HS2 was really badly named. It was about everything other than the speed. It was about the capacity it generated for passenger trains, but absolutely for freight trains. And we really need to persuade government to get the HS2 line going at least as far as Crewe.
It'll be the middle of the night by the time our train reaches Felixstowe Port, so we're jumping off early.
We're just coming into Crewe Junction now, and this really does feel like my old train set.
Well, there you go. That's one ticked off the bucket list. This is Freightliner's Crewe maintenance facility, home to a team of engineers who keep these wheels turning. Louise is showing me around.
What happens at Crewe generally?
So Crewe's one of our main hubs. We've got a big shunting yard outside. We've got a big aggregates depot next door, which is processing all of the materials that are going out for engineering on the network. And then we have our maintenance facility here, where we're maintaining our locos.
And a lot of which are diesel, because like it or not, these are still the workhorse.
Absolutely, still very much the workhorse. There's not a single one of our train pods that we can run on electric end to end in the current state of affairs.
We're not going to electrify the whole of the network, it's just not going to happen. So what can you do in the meantime?
So it's about having a blend of solutions, using electric where we can, a little bit of infill electrification, just another 60 miles in targeted places would allow us to get a third of our services end to end on electric. But where that isn't possible, it's looking at how we use alternative fuels and alternative technologies to bridge those gaps. So battery will have a place at some point in the future. Power density is not there yet, but it's getting there. And alternative fuels are going to be really, really important.
While a completely decarbonised railway is still some way down the tracks, it's already much greener than road. And with electric lorries way behind electric cars and our roads more congested than ever, there's perhaps never been a better time to get stuff off the road and onto rails. Well, the man who can answer some of those questions and pull some of those levers is Rail Minister Hugh Merriman, who's with me now. Hugh, a number of issues raised. One of the things was electric trains more expensive to run than diesel. In Germany, they've capped electricity for trains so it doesn't become more expensive than diesel. Why not do that here?
Well, so this is a private sector market with private shareholders. We're really supportive of rail freight. Where we've tended to put our money is towards grants which allow incentives to switch from HGV usage to rail freight. So almost 1 million HGV movements in the last 2 years have come off road onto rail through that subsidy. So we tend to actually look at it through that particular lens.
But you are up against this real problem of electricity being expensive. I mean, Freightliner, they stood down their electric trains for a while because of the price of electricity. I think DB Rail Freight, Deutsche Bahn, have actually got rid of electric trains altogether, gone back to diesel. How can that be right, given the environmental impact of diesel?
So it is a real challenge at the moment because the price of electricity, as everybody know, is particularly high. We hope these are sort of current spikes that will actually reduce in time. The long-term future for the movement of freight needs to be via electrification. That's why the government is also putting UK taxpayer money in to electrify more and more rail lines. So we've had almost 1,200 miles of electrification in the last 12 years. So of course we see that as a future, but of course this last year has been really challenging for rail freight, but also for everybody in this country.
One of the particular things that was said was if you could just electrify 60 miles more rail, a little bit towards the east of London, Thames Gateway, some towards Felixstowe, East Coast ports, that would really help a lot. Can you deliver that?
So it's a question of choices, because one of the projects that the rail freight industry rightly has been lobbying me to get delivered has been a freight connection which we call the Ely connection, which will help freight go across from Felixstowe to the Midlands rather than going down south. £500 million project, talked about it for years. It's been announced in October by the Prime Minister will deliver that. So we are delivering some of the rail freight priorities, but of course now this one is of course raised as a priority. I'm really happy to look at those interventions to see what we can do. It is, as you say, just at 60 miles and it's those last few miles. So I'm keen to work with the freight industry to see what more we can do, as well as delivering the Ely capacity project, which they're really excited about, and so am I.
We heard a lot about this bottleneck between where HS2 is currently intended to end, Stafford, Handsacre area and Crewe. 40 miles, if you fill that in, they could move so much more freight. Can you do that?
Yeah, so we appreciate that there will be capacity needs to be looked at north of Handsacre on what would have been the HS2 link. Absolutely appreciate that. £500 million has been put in from that decision to work out how we can actually deliver capacity both for freight and passengers. But the idea is to take that money and spend it elsewhere on transport projects. So the project, which we call the Trans-Pennine Route Upgrade, which turns into Northern Powerhouse Rail, will deliver more freight east to west. So it's not just north to south. We've just changed our priorities.
So still not quite clear. Are you saying there will be an upgrade between Stafford and Crewe to allow more trains, more freight to go through there?
No, so what we'll be looking at is the existing route and the capacity pinch points and what we can do to make it more efficient.
What do you think is the future for freight on our rail?
So I think the future is incredibly bright. I think as you look at customers, and I was with a number of freight customers and the freight industry yesterday, customers know that they need to reduce their carbon footprint. One of the ways that they can do that, the big supermarkets, is to get the goods off-road onto rail. The challenge is a lot of them are just not used to rail. They're used to just-in-time movements by lorry. So these financial incentives that either the UK government puts in or private ports like the Port of Southampton can really change attitudes. And as soon as customers switch, then we hope they'll switch for good. So I think it's huge growth. I'm really optimistic.
Rail Minister Hugh Merriman, but now I'm joined by our climate reporter Victoria Seabrook, who was out at COP, the climate summit in Dubai with me. Victoria, what's been happening since I left last weekend?
Yeah, the mood at the start was pretty upbeat. Among the UAE presidency, they managed to land some quite big headline-friendly pledges from a lot of countries. So more than 100 countries agreed to triple renewable power. More than 20 countries said that they would triple nuclear power. 50 oil and gas companies said that they would tackle some of their emissions. And they also got this loss and damage fund off the ground. So that's money to help poor countries cope with the impacts of climate change.
Just on the nuclear question, that always takes a very long time to build. We have experience in this country of almost decades. Is there a deadline on when they're going to triple it?
Yeah, that's by 2050, but even then it's quite ambitious. It's only 20 countries. Nuclear, as you say, it's expensive and sometimes things go wrong in the process, and that's the problem with some of the pledges, is that they're voluntary. And they are nice to have, but they are not the main meal at the COP. They're the garnish, really. Mm-hmm. The main meal is what will come at the end, and that's how the COP presidency will really be judged on how well that they've done. These things are nice to have, but they're not the real substance of the COP. So there's a big push now to translate some of those voluntary commitments that we heard at the beginning of the week into the final text.
And one thing that just strikes me as an observation is that nuclear is often competing against renewables because it's a very low carbon energy source. But while renewables are getting cheaper all the time, nuclear seems to remain expensive.
Yeah, actually the UAE is one of the few examples that has managed to deliver a nuclear power project more or less on time and on budget, the Baraka nuclear power plant, 4 reactors. So when the UAE comes under criticism for being a major oil and gas producer, they point to the success of their nuclear programs.
What's happening this week, as we talk now, and what are we expecting to come up?
The most contentious issue by far is this row over fossil fuel language. So we've had 27 COP climate summits already. Fossil fuels have never even been name checked in any of the treaties, despite being the primary cause of climate change. So in Glasgow at COP26, when the UK hosted the COP, they got some language on coal into the text. That was a coup, that was the first time. But this push has really gathered traction and a lot of tension since then. So more than 100 countries are pushing for a phase out of fossil fuels in some form. Some of them want a few extra words in there to give them some wiggle room, but this is most likely where the major tension is going to be over the next few days. And this is countries are making huge decisions about their future. I mean, it's not the only thing that shapes their energy systems, but it has a big impact, and that's why they will fight so hard. But there could be some other curveballs at the end.
So is this language phase out, phase down? Does it include carbon capture and storage? Is that the real sort of pivot, the judgment of success here?
The UAE will probably be judged on whether phasing out fossil fuels or phasing down fossil fuels makes it into the final text. And if you can't get this kind of language when you've got an oil producer presiding over a COP summit, then when can you do it? Having said that, there's so much else on the table, like funding for vulnerable nations to help them cut their emissions or adapt to climate change, lots of other curveballs that could come up in the last minute. So actually, whilst that is the salient issue, there are other things as well which will help to decide whether it's a success.
I think getting that double F, the fossil fuels, into the text in some form is, feels like a success. Whether it actually goes out or down is yet to be found out.
No doubt, and the language in these texts, it sends signals to financiers, to investors, to markets, and that's why it matters so much, and that is why the fact that countries, negotiators fight so hard over this language is a testament to how much they think it matters.
You make a really good point, though, that real money, billions, trillions of dollars or pounds, hangs on those words. Victoria Seabrook, thank you very much indeed. You can keep across everything that Victoria says and the rest of the climate team about what's happening in COP on the Sky News website and app, or by scanning the QR code that's on your screen right now. We're off to a break now, but when we come back, can you make jet fuel by pulling carbon dioxide out of the air? Welcome back to the show. Now, last week saw the first transatlantic flight powered by what's called sustainable aircraft fuel. That's made from things like waste oils or plant-derived biofuels, but there are big doubts about whether we have enough raw material or land for that kind of fuel. But Sky's Mickey Carroll has been given exclusive access to a project in Sheffield where they're seeing if they can make fuel by drawing carbon dioxide out of the air.
You're looking at the UK's first ever direct air capture plant. These fans are turning Sheffield's air into jet fuel.
The machine behind me allows us to hoover up vast volumes of air, separate selectively the CO2 that is in that atmosphere, and then reject the atmosphere back to where it came from without the CO2 in it.
There's a lot of excitement about direct air capture. Big tech has thrown money at the technology despite the fact it's not a particularly efficient or cheap way of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. The alternative is capturing it in chimneys where it's emitted, but the team here say this is more practical.
If you're deploying on a factory, there's a lot of bespoke integration and essentially design the system every time you need it. So actually it's much harder to deploy than if you just have a shipping container that can be deployed almost anywhere that you have an electricity connection and a water source, which is unique to our technology.
What's happening with this container isn't just about sucking carbon down from the atmosphere. Once that carbon's been removed, it's being used to make this, sustainable aviation fuel. Flying is one of the hardest modes of transport to decarbonise, but the fuel they're making here could help on that journey.
Once we capture the carbon, we can mix it with the hydrogen that's been generated from a sustainable aviation source, and then we can convert it into hydrocarbons or aviation fuel. In terms of the CO2 emission, it is a net zero technology, so this means there's no additional carbon has been added to the atmosphere.
Last week, Virgin Atlantic flew a plane from London to New York for the first time using 100% sustainable aviation fuel. But critics say these fuels aren't a silver bullet.
What can actually be done to cut emissions from flights from these type of alternative fuels is actually quite small. There's a lot of problems with them, so e-fuels, which are made from carbon and hydrogen, require an absolutely huge amount of energy that just isn't going to be available to make them in any more than a very small scale. Biofuels would require a huge amount of land that could cause deforestation and even more emissions.
While making jet fuel out of thin air might not be the cure-all for aviation emissions, for some it marks an important step towards a lower carbon future. Mickey Carroll, Sky News.
Now, as temperature rises, Britain's critical infrastructure is more at risk from extreme weather, and the more the thermometer rises, the greater those dangers, according to risk analysts Climate X. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore has been with them to crunch the numbers.
Britain isn't built to withstand increasingly extreme weather. Sky News and the risk analyst Climatex looked at over 22,000 key buildings and structures that the nation depends on to see how they fared at two different future climates. One where average temperatures rise 1.6 degrees after rapid cuts to greenhouse emissions, and the other where they rise 4.3 degrees because of minimal action. So first up, will the lights stay on? Well, Pembroke and Staithorpe power stations provide electricity to nearly 7 million homes. If temperatures rise by 1.6 degrees, then Pembroke is likely to flood every 60 years and Staithorpe every 40 by the end of the century. But if they climb 4.3 degrees, then Pembroke could flood every 42 years and Staithorpe every 17. What about public transport? Well, Climatex mapped the risk to more than 2,000 rail and tube stations. If temperatures rose by 1.6 degrees, then by the end of the century, 61% would be a risk from storms, seen here in dark blue, and 18% from subsidence, that's in green. But with slower climate action, then that increases to almost 100% for storm damage and around 28% for subsidence. In every category of infrastructure that Climatex looked at, the risks increase with rising temperatures. You can see that clearly in the charts. That's power facilities and rail and tube stations again, but also airports and motorway junctions. More are at higher risk of at least one climate hazard in the year 2100 without rapid reduction in carbon emissions.
Interesting stuff about perhaps the lesser known risk of what happens if we don't reduce emissions fast enough. That's it for this week. Next week we'll be delving into the tricky world of carbon offsets and asking whether rather than planting trees, it might be better to put solar panels on social housing. See you then.